For 6 months, nothing happens. No new car in the driveway, no promotion announcement, no dramatic leap in net worth big enough to screenshot. Every payroll cycle, a chunk of money moves itself out of checking before there's a chance to spend it. The same bills get paid on the same days, quietly, without applause. Meanwhile, a neighbor buys a boat. A co-worker's vacation photos come from somewhere with noticeably better weather, and you start wondering whether staying boring is just a slower way of falling behind. Here's the uncomfortable possibility. The version of financial success that leaves almost no visible trace might be the only version that actually works. The version that photographs well might already be quietly failing. Most of us inherited a scoreboard for financial success without ever agreeing to its rules. It rewards acceleration, a raise that upgrades the apartment, a bonus that upgrades the car, a net worth chart with a satisfying slope climbing toward the corner of the screen. To count as a win, the change is supposed to be visible, comparable to somebody else's, and fast enough to notice without squinting. That scoreboard has one specific flaw. It was never designed to measure the thing that actually determines whether your finances survive contact with real life. In 2015, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau tried to define financial well-being properly, and almost nothing it landed on has to do with a car or a vacation photo. The agency settled on 4 components: control over day-to-day finances, the capacity to absorb a financial shock, being on track to meet a person's own goals, and the freedom to make choices that let someone actually enjoy their life. Notice what's missing from that list. No mention of income, no mention of net worth. The agency's own research is explicit that income, assets, and credit scores by themselves don't describe the full experience of financial life, which raises an inconvenient question for anyone quietly building a reserve while their life looks unchanged on the outside. What if they're already winning a game whose scoreboard was never installed in their living room? It sounds almost bureaucratic until you notice that nobody has ever posted a screenshot of capacity to absorb a shock. Building that kind of position is not free, and it doesn't feel like winning while it's happening. Every dollar that goes into a savings account instead of a better vacation is a dollar that stops being fun in real time. It sits there, earning a modest return, doing absolutely nothing that can be photographed. The same amount spent visibly, a car, a renovation, a night out with somebody's name on the reservation, pays back immediately in attention, if in nothing else. There's a quieter cost layered underneath that one. Opportunity. Cash held in reserve isn't chasing a higher return somewhere in the market. It isn't compounding at the rate a riskier asset theoretically could. Holding liquidity means deliberately accepting a lower ceiling on what the money could become, in exchange for a floor under how far it can fall. That trade only pays off in a future nobody can currently see. Until the day it's actually needed, a financial buffer looks suspiciously like money that isn't working hard enough, dead weight wearing the disguise of prudence. The social price compounds the financial one. When the people around someone signal progress through consumption, their own progress, invisible, procedural, automated, stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like being left out of something. The entry fee for this version of stability gets paid in foregone excitement, foregone status, and a nagging uncertainty about whether any of it will even matter. Nobody hands over a receipt for that. None of this shows up as a single moment. It shows up as a series of small refusals, the upgrade that doesn't happen, the impulse that gets talked down, the extra charge that gets declined before it turns into a habit. Each refusal on its own is too small to notice. Stacked over a year, they're the entire mechanism. Strip away the emotional weather and the mechanism underneath is almost mechanical. Income comes in. Recurring obligations. Rent or a mortgage, insurance, minimum debt payments, subscriptions nobody quite remembers signing up for, go out. What's left over is the margin, and that margin is what can become liquidity, or eventually longer-term assets. Financial stability was never just a function of how much someone earns. It's a function of the relationship between 4 things: income, fixed commitments, how quickly money can be accessed in an emergency, and how much time would be needed to recover if something went wrong. This is also where a raise stops being a simple win. A bigger income can widen that margin, more left over, more that can turn into a reserve, more that can eventually turn into long-term assets. But only if fixed commitments don't expand at the same speed. When a bigger paycheck arrives alongside a bigger lease, a newer car payment, and a few memberships that felt earned, the margin can stay exactly where it started, or shrink, even while every visible number describing that life is going up. Scale on its own guarantees nothing. It just makes whatever was already true, controlled or uncontrolled, bigger and easier to mistake for progress. That margin behaves like a spring installed under an ordinary kitchen floor. Nobody notices a spring that's doing its job. Weight comes down, the spring compresses, and the floor barely moves. Its entire purpose is to convert an impact into something the room can absorb instead of something that cracks the foundation. A financial reserve behaves the same way. Its job was never to make anyone's life look more impressive. Its job is to intercept a shock before it can spread into the rest of a life. Credit, other bills, the next decision that has to get made without panic. It doesn't try to make the impact disappear. It tries to make sure the impact stops exactly where it lands. That's also why a reserve can look identical whether it's working or not, for months at a stretch. A spring under no load and a spring under manageable load look exactly the same from across the room. The only moment anyone finds out what it was actually built for is the moment something heavy lands on it. That's the entire reason the same balance can look like triumph one month and comfortable excess the next. The number by itself was never the whole story. Eventually, something lands. A transmission fails. A refrigerator dies at the worst possible time. A contract ends a few weeks early, or a client pays late. It's rarely dramatic, just an ordinary, forgettable-sounding disruption, the kind that barely makes a story when it's told to a friend later. The reserve absorbs it. The balance drops, sometimes by a lot. For a moment, it looks like months of discipline just got erased in a single afternoon. Except almost nothing else happens. No card carries a balance into next month. No other bill goes unpaid. No asset gets sold in a hurry at a bad price to cover a gap. No decision gets made under the kind of pressure that leads to regret later. The visible result is a smaller number in one account. The invisible result is a chain reaction that simply never started. This is the moment the entire premise of the episode flips. A reserve that shrinks after a shock hasn't necessarily failed. It may have just delivered exactly what it was built to deliver. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's own research office has made this point directly. Someone can show up months after a savings intervention with a balance near zero and still be financially better off than before. Because judging the outcome by the final balance alone ignores the debt that didn't accumulate, the bill that didn't go late, and the hardship that never got the chance to compound. The smaller number is visible. The chain of losses that never happened is not. That asymmetry is the entire trick. Success, in this narrow and specific sense, doesn't leave a highlight reel. It leaves an absence, the sequel to a crisis that never got made. In the weeks after, the same automatic transfer starts moving money again, in the same quiet amounts, on the same unremarkable schedule. Nobody is watching this part either. The reserve doesn't refill in one dramatic deposit. It climbs back the way it was built the first time, a little at a time, off-screen, until the number looks ordinary again. So why does an outcome this valuable still not feel like winning? Part of the answer is that a person's own reference point tends to move faster than their bank balance does. A panel study following more than 7,000 people in Germany over more than a decade looked at what happened emotionally after an income increase. The finding was that the boost to reported happiness faded quickly. Researchers estimated that roughly 65% of that first-year emotional lift had disappeared within 4 years, as the new income simply became the new normal. Status in the same data didn't fade the same way. That distinction matters. What erodes over time isn't the value of the money. It's the emotional charge of a number a person has already gotten used to. The comparison problem runs alongside the adaptation problem. Separate research matching individual income data to information about local average earnings found that people report lower happiness when their neighbors earn more, even after controlling for their own income. The researchers described that finding as suggestive, not proof, of a mechanism, that some of what anyone feels about their own financial position gets borrowed from whoever happens to be standing next door. Stability was never measured against a person's own past. It was measured against whoever bought a boat this year. And when quiet progress stops feeling like enough, action starts to look like the answer. Buying, selling, moving money around produces something a reserve never will. Instant feedback. A trade confirms. A number updates. It feels like doing something, which is easy to mistake for doing something useful. Right up until the data on what that activity actually returns gets involved. That data is unflattering. Researchers who examined more than 60,000 brokerage accounts across the 1990s tracked what happened to the households that traded the most. The top 20% by trading activity earned a net annualized return of about 10% over that period. The average household in the same dataset earned roughly 15.3%. Transaction costs eroded net returns, while the authors interpreted the pattern of frequent trading as consistent with overconfidence. The buffer side of the ledger tells an equally specific story. In a survey conducted in the fall of 2025, only 55% of U.S. adults said they had enough savings to cover 3 months of expenses. 63% said they could cover a $400 surprise expense using cash or its equivalent. 12% said they couldn't cover it by any method at all. Among those who couldn't cover it with cash, carrying a balance on a credit card was the most common fallback reported. The exact kind of quiet compounding cost a reserve exists to prevent. Even households earning $100,000 a year or more weren't exempt from the gap. Only 75% of that group reported having a 3-month reserve. Roughly 1 in 4 high-income households still did not report having one. Earlier research from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, drawn from adults with a credit record, showed how sharply subjective financial well-being differed across savings groups. 68% of people with no emergency savings said their finances controlled their life often or always. Among those with at least 1 month of income set aside, that number was 14%. The cascade itself showed up in the same data. 79% of people without a reserve had trouble paying at least one bill in the previous year, compared with 6% of those with 1 month saved. None of this means money stops mattering the moment a reserve exists, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A 2023 reanalysis of experience sampled data from more than 33,000 employed U.S. adults found that reported happiness kept climbing alongside income for most of the distribution. It didn't simply flatten out at some familiar 6-figure line the way earlier research had suggested. The flattening that does show up in the data is concentrated mostly among the least happy 15 to 20% of people, not the population as a whole. Stability doesn't cancel out income. It's answering a different question than the one income answers. That's really the correction this whole episode has been building toward. The old scoreboard measures what someone can buy or display. It was never built to measure what stopped happening to them. A more honest scoreboard would track something else entirely. How large a shock someone's finances can absorb without it spreading, how many commitments stayed current through it, how much choice was left over on the other side, and how quickly the reserve gets rebuilt once it's spent. None of that produces a satisfying photograph. The apartment looks the same. The car looks the same. What changed is how hard it has become to knock the rest of that life over. Run the tape forward 2 different ways. In the version where this works, income grows a little faster than recurring obligations. The margin gets converted into liquidity and then into longer-term assets, and the temptation to manufacture a feeling of progress through spending, through constant portfolio tinkering, mostly gets resisted. When a shock arrives, the buffer absorbs it and then gets rebuilt afterward. The balance dips and recovers on its own schedule. Nothing about the process produces a dramatic scene, but the person living inside it keeps more time available to make decisions instead of being forced into them by a deadline they didn't choose. A job offer that isn't quite right can be turned down instead of accepted out of desperation. A repair can be priced calmly instead of accepted at whatever quote shows up first. In the version where this fails, income also grows, sometimes faster than in the first version. But new fixed commitments expand right alongside it. A bigger lease, a higher car payment, memberships that quietly convert a raise into recurring overhead before it ever becomes margin. From a distance, this person looks more successful than the first one. Up close, their liquidity hasn't moved. An ordinary shock. The exact kind a buffer is designed for now has to be financed instead of absorbed. A little debt here, a late payment there, a small compromise nobody would call a crisis on its own. Nothing has to collapse for this version to be worse. It only requires that every disruption leave a small, unresolved cost sitting on the following month. A debt that doesn't have to be large to matter, only permanent. Arriving a little sooner each time and quietly resetting what ahead even means. The visible signs of growth stay perfectly intact. The capacity to absorb anything quietly disappears underneath them. Back in that kitchen, months later, another small emergency shows up. Smaller this time, barely worth mentioning to anyone. Something in the plan didn't survive contact with the way life actually happens, the way it never quite does. The reserve reacts the way it's supposed to. It compresses, it absorbs, and the rest of the room barely moves. No card gets touched. No other bill slips. A cup sitting on the counter doesn't even rattle. None of this was ever going to make a life look bigger. It was never built to produce the version of success anyone screenshots, or the story that makes people lean in at dinner. What it was built to do, the only thing it was ever built to do, was make sure one bad afternoon stayed exactly that, one bad afternoon and not the beginning of something worse. Nobody applauds a floor for staying level. That's exactly the point. Financial stability never promised to stop the impact from landing. It only promised to stop it from spreading. Most of the time, that turns out to be the entire difference between a crisis and an ordinary Tuesday.